Hey guys, we are back updating the Power Rankings for Australian Survivor Titans versus Rebels following week 7, the penultimate week of the season. And obviously, this was another pretty interesting week of the show to where we're now down to the final 5. And admittedly, there are definitely some people there that I wasn't expecting to be in the final 5 coming into the merge, but here we are. But there are 8 people to talk about, and let's waste no more time. Let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 8, we have the first boot from this week, and here we have Alex. And obviously Alex has a pretty fun downfall here where he obviously gets a visibility spike with him talking about wanting to make a big move, only for that to backfire. We then see him trying to align with the women, only for them to not really go along with his plans. And then, of course, you have his big moment at Tribal where he ends up laying it all out there and painting a massive target on Kirby's back. But at that point, his fate was pretty much sealed, where it seemed like he was the pretty consensus target there. So obviously, it made sense for him to go out here. And I said this before, I feel like Alex played a pretty terrible game on the season, where he was pretty consistently on the bottom, never really gaining much traction during a lot of it. And obviously, he was let out of certain votes that he probably should not have been let out of. But obviously, he was just kind of dangling in the game for a lot of it. So again, I feel like Alex is probably going to be relatively low on my player ranking when it comes down to it. But he is now out of the game, so he is here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, we have the next boot from this week, and here we have Rihanna. And Rihanna also seemed like a pretty obvious boot by the end of it, where she was largely taken out due to Kirby winning immunity as a way of weakening Kirby down the road. But at the same time, we also saw Kirby being very willing to cut her, where we saw earlier in the episode that she made a deal with Ferris that if he took her to 4, that she'd be fine letting Rihanna go. So even then, I feel like Rihanna was probably not that well positioned to do well here. And kind of similar to Alex, I feel like Rihanna kind of played mediocrely as well, where she was kind of just dangling the game as well. And while she does have her alliance with Kirby, and Kirby kind of leaned on her, but at the same time, it was pretty clear that Kirby was willing to cut Rihanna at multiple points during the season, including in that round before she won immunity. So I feel like for the most part, Rihanna's game was pretty mediocre. She was targeted at multiple points where she probably shouldn't have. And I feel like she was just never winning the season based on the way she was being presented on the show. So I never really saw her as much of a contender because of that. But she is now out of the game as well, to where she's here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, we have the final boot from this week, and here we have Kitty. And Kitty was obviously pretty invisible in the show for a lot of the season, where even this week she didn't really get any confessionals, though at the same time she did get some stuff around camp. And obviously she was kind of in a rocky spot considering her handling of Kirby's relationship, and by that point, like, it was pretty clear that they were going to break up Caroline and Kitty when Kirby won immunity, so she kind of gets unlucky there. But at the same time, Caroline was pretty aloof to the actual plan, to where she threw her idol onto Mark, to where she is eventually taken out there, so obviously that's not particularly great. Now I will say that Kitty's game isn't that bad, where she did seem to be a mostly level-headed player and someone who was in the majority for most of her run. So again, I feel like she will be a bit higher in the ranking, at least compared to Alex and Rihanna, but obviously she is now out of the game, to where she's here at number 6. And with that, there are 5 players left in the game to talk about, and as usual, I'll be ranking them based on how likely I think they are to win the game based on their editing current game position. But number 5, the person I believe is the least likely to win coming into the finale is Caroline. And Caroline is someone who I've been out on for a lot of the season at this point, and the fact that she managed to get to the final 5 is pretty shocking considering I was pretty certain that she was going to be out by the early merge. But now she's here, and I feel like at this point she's probably not winning. I feel like her content up to this point has been pretty negative, where literally we saw in the Rihanna episode that she wanted to take out Mark as being her move, only for her to not get her way there. But then the following round, she decides to pull votes on the Mark just to save him with an idol, which doesn't make a ton of sense there, in an effort to blindside Ferris, but even then doesn't get her way there, where she is completely out of the loop of that plan, where she ends up losing her closest ally in Kitty. At this point, it's looking pretty dire for Caroline, where while there is a shot that she can make it to Final Tribal considering her edit, I just don't really see how a jury awards her with the win, considering that she has come off on the show as this pretty emotional player and someone who has kind of faded into the background during a lot of the post-merge and not being very effective. So again, I feel like I'm still pretty low on Caroline. She's probably not winning, but I will admit she has a shot at making it to Final 2. But for now, I do have her here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and we have someone who also can make it to Final Tribal, but I don't think they're winning, and here we have Raymond. And again, Raymond once again kind of faded into the background, where he doesn't really get much content across this week. Despite him having just made this really insane move the last episode, he kind of just dipped back down, really showing that that episode from last week was more so circumstantial. And again, I don't think he's winning at this point. Now, again, I think there is a chance that he makes it to Final Tribal, kind of like what we saw from Baden from Champions vs. Contenders 2, where while he doesn't win, at least that would explain his edit up to this point. But again, I feel like Raymond is someone who I just don't have a lot of faith in to win inherently based off his archetype and based off the game that he's played. And mixing that in with his mostly invisible edit up to this point, I feel like I can't have him any higher than number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and we have someone who could win a jury vote, but I don't think they're getting there at this point. And here we have Kirby. And Kirby is in a really weird spot at this point, where at this point she's pretty clearly the biggest threat left on the board, to where she essentially has to win out from this point on, where we literally saw her win the last few immunities in spots where it seemed like she could have been in danger had she not won those immunities. So I feel like that's pretty bad. And again, I feel like with the setup that we've gotten from her in previous weeks, I feel like she is the type of person being set up for a downfall here, where eventually Ferris would get the one up on her. And I still very much feel that's the case. But something else that we learned from this week is that Kirby wants to go to the final 2 with Ferris because she wants to beat the best, which is obviously pretty dumb. Now, none of this is to say that I think Kirby will lose to Ferris per se, as I actually think Kirby could win against Ferris considering how much the jury seems to respect her. But I do think that this is a pretty misguided way of approaching the game, not only because you're giving yourself a harder path to a win in a spot where you didn't need to simply to stroke your own ego, but it's also bad from a jury management standpoint where you're kind of talking down to the jury by claiming that they're not the best of the best and that they were put in the jury because they weren't worthy enough. So again, I do very much question this mindset. But to be fair, it's not that far off from how Kirby has approached other points in the game, but whatever. But again, I still think Kirby is in an interesting spot at this point. But again, I feel like with the way the story is being told, I just don't really see how Kirby pulls out the win here. I don't really see how she gets towards the end of the game. And it's for that reason that I have her here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and we are again sticking with the power rankings from last week. And here we have Ferris. Now, I will say that Ferris had a much bigger edit across this week compared to the number 1 person, and I will also say that Ferris probably played this week on a whole better than the number 1 person, where obviously he was in the driver's seat for a lot of the action here, where he took out Alex, followed by Rihanna as a way of weakening Kirby, and then obviously he was part of the plan to take out Kitty, even though there was a plan to blindside him, but that never really went through. So again, I feel like Ferris is in an interesting spot at this point. Now, I will say that coming to the week, it did seem like he could have cut Kirby at that point. But at this point, like, it's kind of a weird spot considering that Kirby actually wants to go to the end with him. And obviously, Kirby is also a massive shield for him. So obviously, that kind of incentivizes Ferris to want to take her deeper into the game. But at the same time, I do also think that Kirby probably beats Ferris in a jury vote as well, considering we have been hearing from the Jury Villa videos that people are expecting people to make a move onto Kirby, and that if they don't, that they'll give Kirby to win. So I do feel like Ferris will have to cut Kirby at some point. It's just a matter of when. And obviously you also have the fact that Kirby keeps winning immunity, and obviously that puts Ferris in a tough spot. So either he takes out Kirby at the first opportunity, but also makes himself a much bigger threat to get towards the end of the game, or he allows Kirby to stay in the game, and then maybe she wins out, takes him to the end, in a spot where she beats him in a jury vote. I do think on the whole, Ferris is probably in a difficult spot to actually win the game from a practical standpoint. But then from an edit standpoint too, I mean, he's just overexposed. He is just the George that we saw from last season. So I feel like that puts him in a very tough spot to actually win the game as well. So again, I am very much conflicted about where to stand. Very similar to how I felt coming into the finale week of Heroes vs. Villains. But again, considering the way that season went, considering how it seems this season is going, I am going to have to leave Ferris here at number 2 simply because I feel like at the end of the day, he's probably going to come short by the end of it. And I feel like that'll probably make a lot of sense from an edit standpoint, but also from a game standpoint. So because of that, I do have him here at number 2. And now at number 1, the person I believe is the most likely to win Australian Survivor Titans vs. Rebels coming into the finale is Mark. And again, this is kind of a weird spot considering I don't think Mark has played that good of a game, where I feel like if Mark were to win from this point on, I would have him relatively low on a winner ranking, as I feel like he has kind of dropped the ball during a lot of the middle stretch of the game. And obviously even this week, like, he hasn't been propped up the most in the world, where obviously the bulk of the content went to Ferris and Kirby. And you can even argue that some of the stuff that happened this week was bad for his game, like obviously with him voting in the minority during the Alex round, and obviously people like Caroline wanting to target him. So that's not particularly great. But at the same time, you could also argue that that stuff was edited in a way to hide Mark from a lot of this negativity, where he was on the outs during the Alex round. And we have heard from him since saying that he needs to like build a good resume and that everyone's trying to play under the radar. So I do think it's sort of an interesting spot for Mark to be in. And I think you also have to consider the practicality of it, like how Mark actually gets to the end in a winning spot. I mean, there is definitely like final two scenarios where he wins. I think he probably beats Caroline at this point. I think he also beats Raymond at this point. It's just a matter of how he gets there. And I think considering the status of Ferris and Kirby's relationship, where Ferris is probably open to cutting Kirby at some point, and obviously Kirby just being this inherent big threat, I think there is a path for Mark to win the game where he obviously takes out the two big threats in a row to ensure that he gets to the final two in a winning spot against like those two smaller jury threats. So again, there is still a path for him, but it's just a question of whether he can actually get it. I am going to say that I lean on the side of him getting it, as at the end of the day, I feel like Kirby and Ferris are too big of characters to actually win a season like this, especially coming off the heels of Heroes vs. Villains. And I feel like Mark has gotten enough content earlier on in the season to where it would make sense for him to kind of sneak out from behind and win by the end of it. So those things lead me to put him here at number 1. And there we go, that'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps with the channel. Now, I will be doing my jury scenarios video for the finale, so you can look forward to that. And after the season is over, I plan to do a player ranking, so you can expect that. I'm also covering other shows like Survivor 46 and Big Brother Canada 12 and The Amazing Race 36 when that starts, so you can expect weekly power rankings of those shows. I'm on Patreon now, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way. But for now, that is the video. See ya.